Chapter 9 The Patron. Once I had decided it did not take me 5 minutes to make the trip, and at once I was the center of a crowd of excited islanders, who all, in the island tradition, had to shake me by the hand. Buller was going mad, tearing about the beach, chasing bits of seaweed, crabs, barging into people, and causing much amusement, generally. They had never seen a bull terrier before, and much admired his obvious strength. Formalities over, we all adjourned to a row of huts, and it was here that I was introduced to the powerful palm toddy so popular over all the islands. I do not know why the scientists trouble to make these H-bombs when there are gallons of palm wine in these islands. I think it has the most powerful kick of any drink I know. Iced and suitably watered down, it is a refreshing drink, but served lukewarm and neat, it has all the attributes of an atomic explosion. After a couple, I certainly felt the effects, and caused much amusement by asking for some water to dilute it. I think I also lost face a bit, but if I was to last out what was obviously to be a session, I could not have stayed the course on neat. On later occasions I drank quite a lot, and was able to keep my end up with the best, which led me to think that served at my first introduction was unusually strong stuff. The trouble is that they seldom, if ever, give it a chance to mature, but serve it a few days from distilling, or rather fermenting. It appeared that when first sighted, we had been mistaken for a schooner that had been due for the last few days, apparently an event in their lives, for it brought news of the outside world, goods urgently needed, and the gossip of all the other islands. Also it was bringing an exchange of staff, for these people work on contract, staying a year, sometimes more, and then returning to their homes. The whole island was given over to copra, as the smell proclaimed. The party was quite a success, until about 7:30, when Willie and Tutu rushed up to me in an agitated state. They had received terrible news. The island belonged to the hated patron's family, and the patron himself was expected on the schooner to pick up the copra and repatriate various laborers, and also bring the new lot. There was only one thing to do. They both agreed, and that was to get blind drunk, which they proceeded to do in a most thorough manner. I told them not to worry, I would straighten things out for them, but it made no difference. They could not believe me. Had they known, they said, that this island belonged to his family, nothing would have made them land there. I pointed out that they would have to meet him some time, either here or elsewhere, and after all there was nothing that he could blame them for. I might as well have talked to a brick wall. Drunk they were going to get, and drunk they got. I declined many offers of a meal, and collecting Buller went back aboard. I noticed that Uhuru's bottom was getting fouled up with weed, and that it would be a good thing if I could careen her there and give her a good scraping. I contemplated hauling her up on the beach there, but ultimately decided that it would be better to wait till I reached Mahi, and put her up on the slip. No doubt they had facilities for that sort of thing, and I could give her a good plastering of anti-fouling mixture and paint. I was surprised at all the growth that had collected. Also, there were some longish, limpet affairs that looked like mushroom stalks. There is some transparent plastic stuff that is used for covering planks of wood in mines, and I wondered whether one could not stick this along the hole below the waterline. It's fairly easy to remove. A really hefty pull will do it, and as it comes off in strips, I see no reason why this material could not be utilized to cover small boats. Then, even at sea, if the bottom gets fouled up, all one has to do is to rip it off, together with all the fungi and fauna. I decided to look into this. Next morning I decided that both Buller and I could do with a good walk, so we went ashore after breakfast, and together with the island's entire quota of children, we walked right round the island. I suppose it was about 3 miles or so round the perimeter. Not yet feeling tired, Buller and I walked round again in the opposite direction. I was surprised how tired I was after the second round. The unaccustomed exercise made my calves ache, and the sneakers I was wearing rubbed quite a lot of skin off my heel. It was plain that I was somewhat out of condition, which surprised me, as for the last few weeks I had been pretty active aboard. The next day or two I spent goggling, bathing, and generally lazing around. Buller, who is not keen on swimming, had a marvelous time with all the kids, playing tug-of-war with ropes, being chased when he stole balls, and exploring all the nooks and crannies of the island with them. He became a great favorite, in what was no doubt an effort to stave off the evil day. Willie and the rest came to me and suggested that perhaps it was time for us to be on our way, but I was enjoying myself, and in any case wanted to stay till the schooner came. Mainly, I must confess, in order to meet the patron. I really looked forward to that meeting, although it had been expected for the last week. There was no sign of it. Later I realized that this was nothing out of the way. Nothing ever seemed to start on time in any of the islands, and for a boat to be a couple of weeks late was nothing at all. Probably the captain had not even sailed when he was due to, owing to the fact that he was enjoying himself where he was. And after all, one day is much like another, and a week here and there is of no account. Time was certainly not of the essence, and I admire the way they disregard it. How delightfully different from all those workers in the cities of the world. It is a crime to be a few minutes late for work. Everything must be on schedule. If a shop is supposed to open at 9 it opens. Not so, however, in the islands. True, it may open at 9, but then again, it may not open till 11, or if the proprietor has something else to do, it may not open at all that day. I was told of the Development Corporation of ground nut fame in Tanganyika that thought that something should be done to help the economy of the islands. All over the Seychelles, there are probably what are the best fishing grounds in the whole world, and the obvious thing to the ODC was to build a fish canning factory. So on one of the islands they built and staffed the most modern and up-to-date factory, guaranteed to purchase all catches at fixed prices, and then no doubt hoped to recover some of the millions of pounds they lost on the groundnut scheme. All went well for the first week. The fishermen had terrific catches. The factory went into production full blast. The fishermen were getting more money than they had ever seen in their lives before, and all was perfect. Then a strange thing happened. Fewer and fewer boats were reporting back with catches, until after about 10 days none appeared at all. The manager and staff were completely bewildered. What had happened was this. 1 week's fishing brought in enough money to enable the fishermen to live very comfortably for the next few weeks, and they saw no reason at all to go out fishing again until all the money was exhausted. Nothing on earth, nor the many arguments, would make them change their minds. Why work when you need not? After all, when the money was spent, a few days out in the boats would replenish empty coffers, and ensure a week or so of delightful idleness, and much wine, and a man would be a fool to work when he had no need. I was told that the factory struggled along for a few months, canning like mad for a week, and then standing idle for the rest of the month, and eventually admitted defeat and packed up and closed down. What has happened to it, I don't know. Probably it is standing there, a monument to a few more wasted millions of the good old British taxpayers' money. Remember the other marvelous scheme they had for Gambia? I think it was. Anyway, it was one of the West Coast places. Chickens. Chickens would bring terrific prosperity to the country. What's more, England would get unlimited eggs and cheap chickens galore. So the good old corporation built miles of chicken houses, huge electric incubators, brooders, feeders, pens, the lot, all at the good old taxpayer's expense. When all was ready, thousands and thousands of day-old chicks arrived and hustled into the brooders. Again, all went well for a time. Then it was discovered that absolutely no food fit for chickens could be grown in the country, so another few millions went down the drain. As for all these loans to developing countries, if the poor taxpayer could see how it's spent, and see the affluent gents driving huge cars bought with their money, they would go mad. I know of 3 African ministers, all of whom have prison records, and another who did a stretch for swindling, who are now living in large houses with cars and servants, all on your money, and traveling around the world first class to attend innumerable conferences. A lovely racket. I had been on the island about 8 days, and had spent the night with a party over on the other side of it, which was the reason why I missed the long-expected arrival of the schooner. My first sight of her was when I came round a point on my way back to my boat, and saw her anchored in the lagoon. She had arrived at the crack of dawn, but my friends and I had been unaware of it. I think that the palm wine the previous evening was the cause of our sleeping late and heavily. Otherwise the noise of her arrival must surely have awoken us. I hurried on down to the beach and joined the crowd, who were lugging piles of copra onto the sands, preparatory to loading up from dinghies and canoes. A fairly large raft had also appeared from somewhere, and sacks of copra were also being loaded on this. Altogether, the beach presented a scene of unusual activity. A dozen or so of time-expired families had all their bundles down on the sands, ready to board as soon as the loading was finished. I looked about for Willie and company, but they did not seem to be there. Neither did I see anybody who might be the patron. I asked where my old shipmates had got to, and was told that they were in a store with the man I was looking for. This was imparted to me with rolling eyes, shrugs, and shaking of heads. I gathered that there was a mother and father of a row going on. I debated whether to go up there or wait till they emerged, and decided to do the latter. I wanted a shave, and thought that it might be as well if I wore a shirt when I tackled this no doubt formidable person. I had just finished shaving when a voice said, "Uhuru ahoy!" and there was a slight bump alongside. I yelled for the owner of the voice to come aboard, adding that I was dressing and he had better come below. I looked at the figure descending. It never seemed to stop. Eventually 6'3" of man appeared and grinned at me. "I'm John," he said simply, as if all the world knew who John was. Not to be outdone, I replied, "I'm Ricky." He nodded. "Damn nice dog of yours. Looks as if he has the Belfield strain in him." Now Buller's kennel name was Lord of Belfield, and his father had been a supreme champion, and come from a long line of champions. I had his pedigree to prove it. My heart warmed to a chap who knew dogs, and bull terriers in particular. "Matter of fact," I said, "you are right. Kennel name is Lord of Belfield. I was just about to make coffee, like a cup. He would. He was, of course, off the schooner, and during the course of conversation he mentioned that he was, as he phrased it, mucking about round the world a bit, and had been running around the islands in the schooner for the last 3 weeks. It's getting a bit boring, actually," he went on. "They don't seem to have exactly a cordon bleu in the galley, and the only other passenger is a French chap who does nothing but tot up accounts or something in books, and makes a noise like a suction pump when he eats." I said it sounded like my man, adding hastily that he was no friend of mine, but I rather wanted to see him. "Ah, yes," said John, "he's the owner of the boat you salvaged. Gather you're a bit of a hero, really. Rescues at sea and all that." I hastily denied being a hero, though it went against the grain, and told him all about it, including my reason for wishing to meet the patron, as I still always thought of him. I said that I intended to sting him every penny I could for salvage, and that anything I got I intended to hand over to the crew. John's eyes lit up. "By Jove, I'd love to be in on that row," he said. I replied that there was no reason why he should not. The whole island would, in all possibility, listen in, and even if they didn't, everyone would know all about it 5 minutes later. We sat yarning and drinking coffee until about 11 o'clock, when I thought that it was about time I went ashore and settled the salvage business. But before we could get on deck, there was another bump, which turned out to be Willie and Company, together with the patron. He was almost exactly as I had mentally pictured him, small, thin, beady-eyed, with that pinched-up mouth that so many Frenchmen have. A long pointed nose added nothing to his beauty, at least in my opinion. You may have noticed that I have never mentioned his name. That is because I don't want to a writ for libel or anything. It is also the reason I have not mentioned the name of the island, because the same gentleman owned it, or at least some of it. The local inhabitants call it La Bastille, though that is not its right name, and in my opinion again, it's maligning it. However, to return to the deck, the patron gave a formal little bow. I returned it. I said nothing. I would let him open the ball. There was a moment of silence. Then he said, "I must thank you, monsieur, for bringing my boat in, which these careless scoundrels wrecked." Here he cast a venomous glare at the unhappy crew, "and inform you that I will replace the rope which I understand you used in the recovery. There is one other matter, apparently as far as he was concerned, the other matter of the boat no longer existed. I understand that you are making for Mahi, and I would be obliged if you could also take these men there. No doubt they would be useful as crew, and they are anxious to return to their homes." "How's that for sheer gall?" I took a deep breath. "Monsieur," I said, "to answer your question, firstly, although I am going to Mahi, I shall probably take a long time to get there. Secondly, these men are in your employ, and, as you say, are anxious to get home. It is your responsibility, I believe, to see that they do indeed get home. I suggest, therefore, that you book them passage on the schooner, which is bound for Mahi." I was rather cutting off my own nose here, as I should indeed be glad to have them as crew. In fact, I had relied on them. There ensued a rapid conversation, which was probably in Creole, which I did not understand. Willie and the others looked as if they were in the dock at the Old Bailey, and had just been given 20 years. The patron then turned to me and used that common island phrase, which I heard so often. With a shrug he said, "As monsieur says," and turned as if to go over the rail. "One moment," I said. "There is just one small matter to be settled between us. Salvage." He started as if stung. "Salvage? I do not understand." "Oh, I think you do. Under international law, I am entitled to salvage money, and naturally I intend to claim it. It can of course be settled between us, or if you prefer, we will take the matter to law. However, as that will undoubtedly cost you more money, no doubt you would prefer to settle the matter privately with me. I am a reasonable man, monsieur, and do not claim more than £1,000. He gaped at me then. £1,000, he screamed. It is impossible that you claim such a fantastic sum. I refuse to pay anything." He ranted off in French Creole, English, stamping on the deck, and almost foaming at the mouth. I could make nothing of what he said, but the words assassin, robber, swindler were pretty clear. He stopped at last and stood glaring at me. I noticed Willie grinning all over his face, and nodding approval to me. Suddenly the patron changed his tactics. Drawing himself up and assuming a haughty attitude, he said, "I will have nothing to do with the matter. You were not instructed by me to bring the boat here, and your claim is ridiculous." I admit it was. The boat was only worth about £500, when in good order, and about half as she stood, and cannot be entertained for one moment. I have thanked you, and will replace the rope. That is the end of the matter. That certainly is not the end of the matter. I want £1,000, and I'm not going till I get it. Otherwise we go to the law. You will go now. I order you to leave this island immediately." So saying, he scrambled over the rail, and calling the crew to follow, was hastily rowed ashore. John grinned at me. "Bit of a chancy claim, what?" I explained that naturally I didn't expect to get anything like that sum. In fact, I reckoned that if I got a tenth, I'd be lucky. "Tell you what," John said. "Actually, I'm a law bloke. Eaten me dinners and all that. Never practiced, of course. Not the brains. Took a degree because the old man insisted. About the easiest one to get. If you like to appoint me your lawman, I'll go ashore and tackle the old bastard." I was delighted. In actual fact, I would not have gone to law over it at all, I don't think, but I thought that John might be able to frighten him out of something. He did. I won't account all the arguments, blasphemy, tears, threats, and general bargaining that went on, but John eventually got his signature to a terrifically legal-looking document, which stated, shorn of the legal jargon, that the patron relinquished all claim to the boat, which became my property, and that I had no further claims for salvage or anything else, and that the boat could remain at the island until such times as I took it away, etc., etc. It was a very impressive document, indeed, and John assured me that it was absolutely waterproof. I had never expected such a bluff to come off, but I undoubtedly underestimated John's powers of persuasion. Another fact was that John learned that the patron had recently had another brush with the law, and had lost his case and a lot of money into the bargain. We then had the pleasure of making out a further document. This one was a deed of gift, wherein I gave the boat to Willie and company, all sharing in equal parts, all very legal and impressive. At first, they could not believe that I had given it to them, and that it was now legally theirs. When it at last sunk in, I had my work cut out to prevent them kissing me. I asked them if they could get a spare mast, bowsprit, and sails locally on the island, but they said that they have to get these in mahi, which they could do easily, and then bring them back on a schooner and fit it out themselves. They reckoned that they could get the lot, including an anchor, all second-hand for £20. It seemed a pity to spoil the ship for a ha'porth of tar, so to speak, so I gave them the 20. I may as well say now that I should have known better. I learned afterwards that when the quartet arrived at Mahi, the money soon went into celebrations. Then, on the strength of being ship owners, they borrowed money to refit, sold shares in the boat, and in no time at all were as broke and in debt as usual. To the best of my knowledge, the old tow is still on the beach, and will no doubt lie there and rot. The schooner was sailing in the morning, and I thought that I might as well be pushing on as well. I was not really looking forward to this part of the trip, as it would mean that I should only be able to sail during the day, when I could see the various reefs and atolls, and I hoped to be able to miss them. At sea, I did not worry unduly about where I was, but amongst the islands it was downright dangerous not to know exactly where you were. Only if it was safe could you have the odd 40 winks. I was below studying the chart when John came aboard. Saluting me very formally, he said, "Any chance of a job as navigator, Captain?" I was delighted and could hardly believe my good luck. I almost leapt at him to shake his hand, but thought I might as well play the game his way. "Are you a member of the Seamen's Union? Are your cards fully stamped? And have you the usual certificates, and so on?" "No," said John. "Right. You're engaged. Bring your dunnage aboard. We sail directly. We feel like it." The next morning the schooner left at dawn. Although close to, she was dirty and smelt to heaven. With her sails spread and a bone in her teeth, she was a pretty sight. I saw her again at Mahi, and tied up to the wharf. She had none of the look of a fine sailing ship, but looked more like a refuse bin. We had a final run ashore, and said good-bye to all our friends, and at about noon we set off. We had no definite plan regarding the next port of call, but had agreed that we would stop at any place that took our fancy. We sailed all that day and the next night, and on the second day sighted a fairly large-looking island that looked as if it would be populated. According to the chart, there was a fairly wide break in the reef and a safe anchorage. We decided to give it a try. Nearly all the islands are of the same pattern, coconut plantations, perhaps a few fishermen on the larger ones, and that's about the limit of trade. Some islands have a fairly large population, whilst others have as few as a dozen. This one had about 50. As usual, when a boat arrives, all the inhabitants came down to the shore to welcome us, and we were showered with the usual invitations. Any event which breaks the monotony of their lives is always welcome, and a ship is a fine excuse to lay off work for the day. Not that the work is ever exacting. Unlike most nut-producing places, they never shin up the trees to gather the nuts, but wait till they fall to the ground, so that all the work consists of is going round picking up the nuts and stacking them in piles, whence in due course they will be husked. I do not think any of them work much more than 3 or 4 hours a day. At least those I met didn't. Our stay here was very much like that at the last place. We danced to a gramophone, drank a good bit, swam, and lounged about. One unpleasant incident occurred. At one spot the reef came close ashore, and John and I were goggling and spearfishing. There were the usual marvelous fish about, parrotfish, angelfish, in the shallower parts, and a host of brightly colored little ones, of which I did not know the names. I was idly pushing myself along, under water, by shoving my feet along the rocks, when I suddenly found my right foot held fast. Something was holding my flipper. I gave a tug, but couldn't free it. Whatever it was gripping the extreme end of the rubber, and had fortunately not managed to grab my toe. For a moment I nearly panicked, and I struggled to free myself by main force. I got a purchase with my left foot, and pulled and jerked for dear life. I looked quickly round, but John was not in sight, although he had been at my side a moment before. This struggling was exhausting, and I was getting very short of breath, and knew I would have to do something drastic. I had a knife with me, and I got it out of its sheath and prepared to battle with whatever it was that was holding me. I had to wait for what seemed ages for the water to clear, for I had stirred up a lot of sand in my struggles. But when, at long last, I could see, I saw that what was holding me was a large clam. Evidently, I had shoved my foot against it to push myself along, and it had clamped down good and fast. It is impossible to force one of these large ones open, but it was only the work of a moment to undo my flipper and release my foot. I shot to the surface just in time. I could not have held out much longer. It was only by the grace of God that it had not closed on my foot. Had it done so, I could not possibly have freed myself. I believe some men have been caught and drowned in this way. I might perhaps have hacked my foot off with my knife, but doubt if my breath would have held out, and in any case I might not have been able to do it. However, all's well that ends well, and I suffered no real harm, beyond getting a hell of a fright. There is always an element of danger when goggling around tropical reefs, from moray eels, stingers of various sorts, sharks, and my friends the clams. It is surprising that there are not more fatalities. Of course, there are a lot, but one seldom hears of them. Many native fishermen in the tropics succumb to some of these hazards, and a lot get drowned when their frail craft overturn when well out to sea. But when you consider all the thousands of people who indulge in the sport of goggling, many even poor swimmers, very few seem to get into real trouble. We stayed at this place for a few days, till my foot had resumed normal proportions. It had swelled up quite a bit, caused, no doubt, by my stupid struggling, and then set off again. At every island we received the utmost hospitality. They really are the most delightful people. Only one incident marred the trip. We had gone ashore, and as usual, Buller was with us. After the usual greetings and handshakes, one of the men said to me, "It is not good to bring your dog ashore. The manager he has a very large dog, and it has killed all the other dogs on the island. He is very proud of it and likes to see it kill the other dogs. It chases them, and when they run, it seizes their back legs and breaks them. Then, when they cannot stand, it bites them in the throat. I wondered what to do. I didn't want old Bullard to miss his run ashore, which he enjoyed so much, and on the other hand, I didn't want him hurt in a fight. I didn't think he would get killed, but he might get savaged a bit, although I thought that he would when in the end. Whilst I was thinking this over, the matter was settled for me. Out of the house dashed an extremely large and scruffy-looking mongrel, which without the slightest hesitation made a beeline for Buller. I suppose he expected Buller to start running for safety, when no doubt he would have employed his usual tactics of grabbing his back legs. He did not know bull terriers. Buller, who was about 30 yards away from us, stood there and watched him coming. The other dog was evidently expecting him to run and come on full tilt. When he was about 2 yards from Buller, Buller suddenly leapt at him. They met with a thud, and both dogs were sent rolling on the ground. They were on their feet in an instant, but I saw that when Buller had leapt, he hadn't missed, and he had the other dog firmly by the throat. Nothing on earth could have loosened that grip. I knew from past experience it was useless to try, but nevertheless I ran forward to have a shot. It was no good. I told him to drop it, and caught hold of him, tried to lug him off, but could not make him let go. In about 20 seconds it was all over. He had evidently bitten through the artery or jugular, or whatever dogs have in their throats, and it was a very dead dog indeed. I was sorry about the whole incident, but not so the natives. They were saying Buller was a marvelous dog, a lion of a dog, a magnificent animal, and congratulating me as if I had won a victory. I gathered that the dog had not been above chewing a few of the local inhabitants. I took Buller into the sea to clean him up a bit, and when we came out there was a crowd round a rather large chap who was shaking his fist in the air and apparently cursing everybody within sight. I suspected that he was the owner of the dog, and how right I was. He rushed up to me and asked if I was the owner of Buller. I said I was, and added I was sorry about his dog, which indeed I was. He started to yell at me, in the local argot, which I couldn't understand. I tried to say that his dog had started it. It was a fair fight, and that there was nothing anyone could do now about it. He continued to rave, so I turned to walk away. I had no sooner turned my back on him when I got a stunning clout on the side of my head, which knocked me onto the ground. I was so surprised that I lay there for a moment, gathering my wits. The next thing I knew, he had kicked me on my thigh. I saw John start forward, but I yelled, "Lay off, John." Now I've knocked about mining camps all over the world, and had a few good fights. I prefer Queensberry rules, but Queensberry or Rough House, it's all the same to me. When I called out, I suppose he thought that I was yelling for mercy, or because I was hurt, and he prepared to make another kick at me. In a rough house, anything goes. I rolled away from his flying boot and jumped up. He came in to hit me, but I had grabbed a handful of sand as I rose and threw this straight in his eyes. This stopped him in his tracks. He put both hands up to his eyes, and this gave me a lovely chance. I hit him under the heart, and as he doubled up, I put all my weight behind a left hook, which landed bang on the point of his jaw. He went out like a light. My head and my leg hurt like hell. I don't generally get a headache after a clout, but I suppose my head was still a bit groggy after that concussion I had. I stood there for a moment, feeling a bit dizzy, but was roused by slaps on the back and numerous handshakes from the spectators. Evidently, I had laid out an unpopular character. This proved to be the case, for I was later told that he had a habit of getting roaring drunk and then beating the daylights out of his wife or anyone else unlucky enough to cross his path. He came round after a bit and shambled off to his hut, where I suppose he remained. During the next 2 days we stayed there, for I didn't see him again. I had a headache for a day or so, and a hefty bruise on my thigh, which lasted for weeks, but that episode was the only unpleasant one to happen during my whole stay in the islands. I may say that as a result of the scrap, both Buller and I were held in great esteem by the islanders, and I was often embarrassed by people staring at us and saying, "Ah, what fighters," and other similar remarks. Unfortunately, I had to refuse invitations to several parties, owing to having that wretched headache, which I dared not augment by drinking. From then on, our progress might be best described as island hopping. As I think I have said, there are 92 islands, and if you include atolls, over 900. I cannot remember the names of all the islands we called at. Some we stayed at a couple of days. Some we passed altogether, mostly depending on the time we came up to them. As can be imagined, currents swirl about amongst this crowded area, and we made a point of sailing during the daytime only, owing to the tricky navigation required. I'm sure that I could not have got through that lot alone. It would have been impossible to have kept a sufficient watch. As it was, we had several very narrow squeaks, avoiding atolls just awash. I may say with gratitude that the hospitality offered us by the people on the various islands was terrific. We often had difficulty in departing without appearing to be rude. Everyone wanted us to stay, just a week longer or a month, what matters? It was a marvelous life, sailing from island to island, in perfect weather, stopping when we felt like it, staying as long as we liked, bathing, goggling, fishing, and enjoying the abundant hospitality of the islanders. Fresh fruit there was for the picking, and lobster a la Creole had to be eaten to be believed. Another great treat was the beautiful hot crusty new bread. But a word of warning: beware their palm toddy, delightful as it is to drink, especially when iced. The effects on the novice are appalling. It is one of those subtle drinks that suddenly hits you with the kick of a mule, and the resultant hangover is ghastly. Do not, I beg of you, ever have a hair of the dog the next morning, as one will knock you out flat. Stick to Alka-Seltzer, double strength, until you have fully recovered. The last port of call was Proslin, famed for the Coco de Mer. This island is the only place in the world where that peculiar nut grows. It is a very rude-looking nut, kind of double coconut. It grows in the exact replica of a woman's behind, etc., even down to the pubic hairs. Many years ago, an occasional nut used to be washed up on the shores of India, where they commanded a terrific price as an aphrodisiac. No one knew where they came from. A peasant or fisherman, finding one of these, could sell it for sufficient money to enable him to retire in comfort for the rest of his life. But these things never last, and a time came when an English frigate happened to call at the island, and found them growing there in profusion. The captain, being a good man of business, loaded up with them, and sold them, presumably, at a good profit. Alas, one of the sailors mentioned where they had found them, with the result that the Indian skippers soon began to bring back boatloads, and this naturally soon ruined the market. Today, the government protects these trees, and one cannot pick and sell their fruit. However, those that eventually ripen and fall to the ground are carefully collected and then highly polished and sold to tourists as souvenirs. These will be offered to you by giggling girls who pretend to be bashful. If you cut a young woman off at the waist, and about 6 inches above her knees also, the part you would have left would be exactly like a Coco de Mer, both back and front. This island is also supposed to be the original site of the Garden of Eden, and indeed there is a valley wherein grows all manner of strange plants and fruits. Also, in this valley you will find the black parrot, the only place in the world where you will find it. This also is rightly protected. It is also the abode of huge rainbow-colored spiders that spin webs of the consistency of blind cord. I am sure that they would twang if you plucked them. It was here that we discovered that the birds on most of the islands are tame. As John and I walked along this very odd valley, we noticed that we were escorted by about 10 brightly colored cardinal birds. They are very small finches, bright red, and when we stopped to rest, upon one occasion, several of them came and settled on us. They were not a bit afraid, and we found the same in Mahi. If one stopped and put out one's hand, generally a bird of some sort would settle on it and look expectantly for scraps. There is one particular bird, a sort of small dove, blue, with a pinkish chest, that seem to take it for granted that every one is a bird lover. These birds will fly down and raid your tea table, settle all over you, and coo in a soft, crooning manner. They must have very soft bills, because they seem incapable of breaking up the smallest piece of cake, and you have to crumble it up before they can get it. If ignored, they will gently peck you, until in desperation you feed them. We chatted to the local doctor over a beer, and he told us that most of the natives suffer from worms, hookworms that is, owing to their habit of going barefoot. I noticed he also walked about the roads without foot covering, and he said, "Oh well, we generally wear sandals when a boatload of tourists comes in, but it's so much more comfortable barefoot." I didn't like to ask him if he got worms. It was whilst on Proslin that I had my first experience of a hurricane, only the extreme outer edge of one, but enough to realize what one could be. We were drinking Tiger beer in the one and only bar, at least the only one we found, when it turned noticeably colder. For the last couple of days we had not listened to the wireless, but apparently there had been a warning that a hurricane that had struck Madagascar was rushing up the Indian Ocean on its way to India. Towards the evening it got quite cold, at least cold for those latitudes, and the wind got up to about 25 knots. This wasn't much of a wind, but then the center was reported to be 400 miles away. We were on the fringe. That night it started to rain, real tropical rain, and it kept it up for 3 days and nights. What had been gentle streams became raging torrents. The roads were turned into rivers. Many of the fragile native huts and houses were washed away. We heard later that over 400 had been rendered homeless, and in Mahi through this cause, and transport all over the island came to a standstill. The anchorage there is not at all good. There is hardly any protection. We decided that the best thing to do was to stay aboard. Even rowing the few hundred yards from shore to boat, we had to bail out the rainwater. For 3 days we stayed below, practically all the time, with everything getting damp and musty. All 3 of us were miserable, cold and damp. Even the Tiger beer didn't compensate. We woke up on the 4th day to find that the sun was shining in a blue sky. We would have sailed on to Mahi, which was in plain view about 20 miles away, that day, but we had been invited to a party by some girls we had met, and no gentleman likes to disappoint a lady, so we spent most of the day drying out everything and trying to find some decent, clean clothes. John had a bright idea. He said that there must be some good soul ashore who took in washing, so we stuffed 2 bags full of shirts, shorts, socks, and general clobber, and took the lot to a huge fat woman we soon located, who obliged in this respect. It was returned to us about 4 in the afternoon, absolutely impeccable. It seemed rather a shame to wear it. About 6 we togged ourselves up in this splendid regalia, and, as they had a couple of dogs, we left Buller aboard, much to his disgust. We had not realized that the roads would still be a morass of mud, and by the time we got to the party, the ends of our trousers were mud-logged, so to speak. Our hostess invited us into the kitchen, and insisted on sponging most of the mud off. But there is no getting away from the fact that our sartorial magnificence was somewhat dimmed. It was a whale of a party. It started off with about 10 invited guests, but by the time it was over, there must have been 50 or more. People kept drifting in, and after the local fashion, everyone had to be introduced, and their hand shaken. A huge meal of roast pig, and oh, they know how to make lovely crisp crackling. Fish of all descriptions, yams, all fluffy like the best potatoes, fruit galore, and many dishes I could not put a name to. Nor was liquid refreshment lacking. I stuck to beer, but John was inveigled into drinking palm toddy, and had a head containing the fires of hell the next morning in consequence. From somewhere or other, musicians appeared, and after that, naturally, a dance started up. No notice was taken of the couples who wandered into the palm groves, and a good time was had by all. Our Lady, who had obliged with the washing, turned up, and proved of sterling worth when a couple of chaps started a fight. She merrily walked up to them, grabbed each by his neck, knocked their heads together with a fearful crash, and flung them apart. At some time during the evening, a rather scruffy individual came up to me and said something about a friend of his who our fierce English bulldog had attacked when he was on our boat. I knew that Buller had bitten no one when we were aboard, and as far as I knew, no one had been aboard when we were not there. Besides, I was having a jolly good time, and couldn't be bothered with a little thing like that. He kept on sidling up to me when I was dancing and sang, "But my friend, monsieur," until I was fed up, and landed him a clip in the ear, whereupon he went off. My partner said, "Ah, a bad man that." We eventually got back aboard, as dawn was breaking, to find the hatch firmly bolted from the inside, and Buller apparently standing guard outside. John bashed the hatch, and yelled for whoever was inside to open up. Buller prepared to battle, so I grabbed him, not knowing who was inside, and not wanting him to attack some innocent party. I need not have worried. The individual who eventually appeared was a real scoundrel by the look of him. We asked him who he was and what he was doing aboard, and he started to jabber in the local argot, which was incomprehensible to us. We decided to search him, and were not surprised to find my fountain pen, a spare watch of John's, my cigarette case, which although I never used, I valued, and several other items. Buller had evidently managed to get one good grab in, as his trousers were torn and blood-stained. We decided not to charge him, but to chuck him overboard and let him swim for it, and despite his struggles, over he went. He had about 300 yards to swim, and had we been completely sober, we might not have done it, as these waters teem with shark, which have been known to take a man in 3 feet of water. How he got aboard, I don't know. Probably rowed out there by his friend, who annoyed me, and when Buller went into action, his pal probably decided to push off. I suppose he got ashore safely, for we never heard another word about him. I may say that that was the only case of theft I ever heard of in the islands. They are the most honest people I have ever met, and the only crimes seem to be the usual Saturday night drunks and fights. Truly, these islands are the nearest thing to paradise I know. Chapter 10. Mahi. Now I was due for my ultimate goal. At long last I was set out on the final 20-mile leg to Mahi. We both overslept, and instead of starting at 10 a.m., as we had planned, we did not wake till that hour, and eventually got under way at about 11. Much to our surprise, it was dead calm, not a drop of wind, and the sea was like glass, and if we were to go, that meant the engine. I was rather sorry in a way, as I had pictured myself flashing into Mahi Harbor, all sails set, and arousing the envy of the locals. However, I might have dashed into the harbor, so perhaps things were better thus. We argued as to whether it would be better to arrive after 4 o'clock, when the customs and immigration people would probably have knocked off for the day, and might not trouble us till the morrow, or whether if we did this, and they were fellows who put duty before everything, and turned out specially for us, they would be in a bad temper and throw the book at us, or whether we should make port at about 3. We decided on the latter. We cruised along at about 6 knots, and I admit I was pleased and sorry at the same time. Pleased because I would have succeeded, and sorry because here was the end of the voyage. Mahi loomed nearer and nearer, the white ball of the tracking station showing clear against the blue sky. Soon we could distinguish houses, cars, and people. Lying out a mile or so was a liner, the Karanja it turned out to be, and judging by the activity of small boats and the general traffic round her, she was about to sail. We were met by the pilot boat when we had drawn about level with the Karanja, and were ushered into the berth for yachts. We tied up alongside the Sea Wind, which turned out to be fortunate for Buller. The Sea Wind was a catch, a lovely little job, being sailed by a husband and wife team round the world. Their name absolutely escapes me, and they were held up waiting for engine spares from Kenya. The pilot had said that the usual officials would be aboard as soon as the Karanja had sailed. I gathered that the IMI and immigration departments were the same bunch of chaps. We wasted no time, but hurriedly topped up the drink locker against it being sealed, leaving the usual 2 bottles in plain view on the chart table. The cases, of course, would be counted and sealed again. This done, we went on deck and introduced ourselves to the couple next door. Almost the first questions are fraternity, for I now rated myself amongst the elect. Ask is, where have you come from, and where are you going? And whilst we were talking of these pleasant matters, we spotted officialdom arriving. They could not have been nicer. I got the usual cracks, which I was now getting used to about having been searched for, reported probably lost, etc., and we were made free of the island. Official business concluded, and the drink sealed up as usual. A friendly tot was had by all, and they departed. Now I swear I had not thought of it, but about 10 minutes after they had gone, I remembered Buller. He was nowhere aboard, and I supposed that he had disobeyed standing orders and jumped ashore, which he could easily do, as we were only a couple of yards from the jetty, tied up, with an anchor out forward. I looked anxiously about, but could not see him. I always declare him to the medical authorities, but on this occasion I had not given him a thought. Generally, of course, he made his presence only too obvious. I had visions of fines and quarantine. On the other islands there had been no officials to worry about, but we were now in the capital, and no doubt rules and regulations abounded, though I later discovered that everything was run on a nice friendly basis. There might be rabies ashore for all I knew, though I also knew that Buller was entirely free from any disease. Whilst I was a prey to these dark thoughts, I suddenly heard the sort of crooning noises women make when confronted with a cuddly kitten or something. "Oh, isn't he a sweetie? He's kissing his auntie. Oh, he does love to be scratched," etc. And there was Buller, as large as life, in the cockpit of Sea Wind, being cuddled. By its lady owner, and lapping up every minute of it, a silly grin on his face, and his tail going like a helicopter. He had apparently jumped from one boat to another. We were invited aboard for tea, and had the most delicious hot doughnuts I've ever tasted. She promised to teach me how to make them, a promise, I may say, that was duly kept, and although I have never attained such perfection, I turn out a pretty nifty doughnut. Just as it was getting dark, there were cries of "Uhuru," and there, coming up the jetty, were a small crowd of people, which included the crew from the tow. Tutu leapt aboard and flung his arms round me, and planted a smacking kiss on my cheek. My back was slapped by all and sundry, my hand shaken till it nearly dropped off. The object of this visitation was to invite me to a party that night. I made a suggestion that the party be the next night, as I was tired. Also, there was a lot of work to be done before the boat was snugged down, and so on, but it was no good. The party had to be that night. Eventually it was arranged that we all meet at Sharky's bar at 8 prompt. With more handshakes and back-slapping from everyone, the deputation departed, with the exception of Tutu, who stayed, so he said, to show us the way, but whose real object apparently was to borrow a couple of quid. He innocently explained that he would not like to see me pay for everything, and felt it would be up to him to stand around. I then gathered that the party would be in the nature of a colossal pub crawl, the glorious drunk I had promised the crew when and if we arrived at Mahi. Well, a promise is a promise, and at 8 we duly arrived at the first pub, A committee of about 10 were there, and after a few drinks we were joined by some females, who suggested that as there was a dance at some pub or other, we go there. On the way to this dancing pub were 1 or 2 other refreshment bars, and it would obviously have been a crime to omit these from our itinerary. I felt a bit like the Pied Piper. At each place, our numbers grew, and it was explained, with much exaggeration, to the assembly how I had rescued them from a watery grave. This explanation called for handshakes all round, and of course drinks. We were quite a sizable crowd by the time we reached the dance. Most of the couples were girls dancing together. But we soon put a stop to that. I gave a traveler's check for a $5 to the proprietor, and intimated that when that was used up, I would be also. Drink is very cheap there, and that $5 seemed to last far too long. I don't remember how many other bars we visited, but the party ended up at somebody's house, at which a huge woman, who couldn't have been less than 16 stone, kept sitting on my knee and whispering exotic suggestions as to how we could spend the rest of the night together. The crew had been lost somewhere, and we seemed to be amongst about 20 strangers. One of the men turned out to be a taxi driver, and after a lot of persuasion, he ran us back to the quay. Apparently, it had been a good party, because a copper told me the next morning that we had left a marvelous train of drunks behind us. The next fortnight was spent in exploring the island, and what a paradise it is! Magnificent scenery, islands dotted all about the surrounding ocean, fruit and fish in abundance, and the friendly and hospitable inhabitants, always inviting you to picnics and parties. For anyone thinking about retiring, I heartily recommend Mahi. The government estimates that one can live well on £600 a year, and in fact, that is the sum which they insist upon retired people having. This includes a servant and running a car, in fact, all living expenses. Whilst there, I bought a very beautiful plot of land, or rather leased it for 60 years. The cost, £16 a year. The cost of building a decent house on it was, I was told, about £1,500. They build with granite blocks over there. I reckoned that a 60-year lease and a granite house would last out my lifetime. John received news that his sister was coming out to Zanzibar to marry a chap at the USA tracking station, and would accompany him back to America a couple of days after the ceremony. And she asked him to be there to give her away. It was arranged that I should pick him up in Zanzibar in a few weeks' time, and he caught the next boat there. He would get there in 3 days. I wondered how long I should take. Actually, I felt pretty confident, because John had held my nose to the navigational grindstone for a couple of hours or so each day, and had at last been satisfied that I could be trusted to find my way back to East Africa. I returned to the boat one evening to find the original Ancient Mariner sitting on the hatch. His name, believe it or not, was David Jones, and he had sailed before the mast in the old four-masters. He had awful tales to tell about rounding the Horn, on one occasion being driven back 5 times, and missing icebergs by inches. He didn't hold much by scientific navigation, though in steam perhaps it had its uses. A real sailor, he maintained, could tell exactly where he was by the look of the ocean. In the following days he taught me many weird and wonderful knots, and also how to splice, in a proper sailor manner, with no lumps and bumps, nor danglers. He was full of ancient lore, and his conversation was spiced with "when there's wind before the rain," "soon it will be fine again," and many similar adages. He arrived one day in a very bad temper. Apparently he had read that the moon has no effect on the weather. He held that whatever weather there was at the new moon, so it would continue till the next moon. Everyone knew that the moon drew the sea to make the tides, and it stood to reason that it also drew the atmosphere, which naturally affected the weather. It sounded good sense to me. I had the wireless on one day, and we listened to a group singing sea shanties. This was a mistake. Some of the shanties, he maintained, had never existed, and in others they got the words wrong. Thereafter, the wireless was referred to as that lying machine. I am eternally grateful to the sea lore my old friend David Jones taught me. All too soon the time arrived for me to be making tracks for Zanzibar. I spent the next few days preparing for the effort, topping up with fuel, water, food, and doing all the 101 things that always crop up at the last moment. By Thursday I was ready and intended to set off on Friday, but this so horrified the ancient mariner, who had never in his life heard of a ship sailing on a Friday, and predicted mostly ghastly evils if I did so, that in deference to his superstitions I delayed till Saturday. But Saturday night in Mahi is not to be missed, and one needs a quiet Sunday to recover, so it was not till Monday that I departed. It was a beautiful morning, with a nice fresh breeze, and I looked forward to a quick, trouble-free trip. I was well armed with charts showing probable strength and direction of currents to be expected this time of the year, and if my navigation was not 100%, I could hardly miss Africa. Actually, of course, I was hoping to make Zanzibar dead on course. As soon as I was clear of the island, I set main, mizzen, and jib, and I found I was making a good 5 knots, which was about what I had expected. It was good to be at sea again, and although I missed John's cheery companionship, I was well content. We soon had a school of dolphins playing about round us, and I marveled anew at the grace and agility of these animals. They would flash by and go ahead, only to return with the same speed, leaping through the swells, and thoroughly enjoying life. I wanted to catch a fish, but knew that it was useless to try whilst they were about. They left us about noon, and I took what was an excellent sight. Actually, I was still in sight of Silhouette Island, but it was nice to know that I had marked off my chart correctly. Back on deck, after my calculations, I put a line out, and in no time at all hooked a nice fat bonito. I ate it the Creole way, raw with lime and finely shredded. I had filled one thermos with real turtle soup and also had 1 cup of this. It is very rich and filling, and I find that 1 cup is sufficient really for a meal. I had always thought that one merely stewed slabs of turtle to make it, but I found out in the islands that one has to use the jelly part, which clings to the shell. I may say that the mock turtle soup one gets in tins is as much like turtle soup as I am like Greta Garbo. After the meal, I decided that it was time to set the sails, so that she would steer herself. To my consternation, I found that I was unable to do this. I tried every combination I could think of, but she would just not hold her course. This was a blow to me, as although I don't need much sleep, I obviously would have to have some, and it meant that I should have to heave to whilst I slept, and lose a lot of time. This would not have worried me if I had not had to meet John. I stuck at the helm till midnight, then lowered everything, went below, and let her roll and drift. I set the alarm for 5, and tumbled in. As usual, 5 o'clock came all too soon, and after a hasty breakfast, I set the sails again, and we continued on our course. I wondered how much we had drifted during the night, and when I took a sight at midday, I found that the drift was only about 3 miles north. I think that the wind must have counteracted the current, which was to the north, the wind being northeast. I had made 90 miles since yesterday noon, and considered this pretty fair. Nothing of note happened for the next 2 days, but the third evening out I was sitting in the cockpit, when the sea around seemed suddenly to boil. Short, choppy little waves were coming in all directions. They were about 2 feet high, and would meet each other with a smack that sent spray shooting up a few feet in the air. I thought at first that this must be caused by a school of large fish, but soon realized that the wavelets were too big to be caused by this. This kept up for about half an hour, then stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Nobody has been able to give me an explanation of this phenomenon, except to suggest that it was the meeting place of 2 opposite currents. But the charts make no mention of a current other than the steady northerly one. Besides, judging by the directions the waves were coming from, it would have needed 4 currents, one from each point of the compass, to have caused this. That night I remembered to switch on my masthead light, and hoped that it was tall and bright, enough to be seen by a liner, as I was well in the shipping lines. At least, I hope so. I had forgotten to do this the previous nights. Now, when I was at Mahi, I had amused some kids by making a kite for them. It was quite a large one, octagonal in shape, about 6 feet across. It was made of some plastic material that looked like aluminum and had a nice shine on it. We had sent it up at night and shone torches on it, and we were certain that everybody would think it was a flying saucer. This had given me an idea. The ancient mariner had told me of one ship he was on that had a moon sail, whatever that was, and it was the tallest sail in the world. On one occasion we had tied this kite to a canoe, and it had towed it along the lagoon. It was very strong, being strutted with thin, slightly tensile steel rods, and the material was extremely tough indeed. I thought that here was my chance to outshine the ancient mariner's moon sail, and also lay claim to having the tallest sail in the world. I spent some time that night in fitting a small electric light to it, and for cord I used a whole roll of flex, which I had picked up in the islands cheap, in the hope that it would come in for something. At about midnight I sent it up, connected the other end to a battery, and switched on. It certainly looked weird, that lonely light in the sky. Unfortunately, the wind was not dead astern, so it was not much use as a sail. I may say here, however, that I tried it out in a lagoon at Mombasa, and it pulled a hooroo along at something like a half a knot. Being made of shiny silver stuff, it certainly did look like a flying saucer when lit up. I was averaging 90 miles a day, and reckoned that I should, at this rate, take about 18 days or so to reach Zanzibar. Nothing much of interest happened until the 13th day out. It had just got dark, and full night had come suddenly, as it always does in these latitudes, and I was sitting in the cockpit, idly watching a rather brilliant star that was slowly appearing on the horizon. I glanced at it from time to time, wondering what its name was. By this time it looked to be about a yard up from the horizon. Suddenly, as I watched it, it started to go down. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. All the adjacent stars were also disappearing below the horizon on the port side. I glanced hurriedly at the moon, but that seemed stationary enough, and so did all the heavenly bodies to starboard. Then I realized what it was. There must be a hell of a large swell coming. Sure enough, I could feel the boat rising the next moment. There had been a long steady swell all day, with a smooth sea, but this was the father of them all. I don't know how long this sensation lasted, but at a very wild guess, I should say that wave was half a mile across. This I thought could only be a tidal wave, though it was not what I had imagined one to be. As a child, I had often been frightened by a picture of a tidal wave, which an aunt had. It showed a street and a town with people running in fear, whilst behind this street A huge wave towered over the top of houses and churches. Dotted about in this monster wave were wrecks of four-masters, steamers, bodies of people and animals. I must say I used to keep a pretty sharp eye on the sea when I was building my sand castles, lest one of these waves appeared. However, although it was not my idea of a tidal wave, I decided that that was what it must be, and confirmation seems to come from the fact that days later Karachi was struck by a tidal wave, and much damage was caused. I expected the sea to be all over the place as soon as the wave had passed, but it resumed a pretty even swell, though perhaps slightly larger than formerly. Now I thought, I only want a nice typhoon, although I was dead scared of one, and I shall be able to really chuck my weight about in the yacht clubs all over the world. I remember one typhoon I was in. It happened just after I had sailed over the top of a tidal wave, sort of thing. Matter of fact, I was feeling pretty bucked. I had plenty of thrills on this Seychelles voyage, but they were all nice, safe ones. I could now handle a hooroo as well as most, and I could, I hoped, navigate even if I could not emulate the ancient mariner, and tell where I was by merely glancing at the ocean. That, no doubt, would come in time, probably 50 years. The monsoon had settled down, and was nice and constant. I was getting back into the 10 to 15 knots, gusting to 20, department so beloved of the Kenya weather reports. The lazy days rolled by without any incidents, until the night came when I hoped to hit Zanzibar. Lord knows I had checked my calculations often enough. I set my alarm for 5, and turned in, but for once sleep eluded me. I was worried because I wondered whether I was much nearer than I thought, and had visions of crashing on some coral shore during the night. However, I eventually dozed off, but awoke a few minutes before the alarm went off. Today should be the day. The temptation to shin up the mast was almost irresistible, but I tortured myself by resolving not to look until I heard the 9 o'clock pips on the wireless. Meantime, I busied myself about deck, doing those jobs that always seem to crop up. I put a line over the stern, and almost immediately hooked a nice sea salmon, about 6 pounds. I gave half to Buller as a treat, having first boned it, and then, having some lemons aboard, I thought I would try some of it in the Creole way, that is raw, shredded, and with lemon juice. I wasn't really hungry, but I had to do something to fill in the time till 9 o'clock. It really was delicious, and I must have eaten about a pound of it, although, as I said, I wasn't hungry. Eating raw fish this way is a bit like eating nuts. One keeps nibbling. Of course, the best way to enjoy this dish is with a good salad, but I have never met anyone yet who had salads aboard, except, of course, in port. At last I heard the pips, and scrambled up the mast. I'm sure I must have nearly split my face in a grin of triumph. There, just discernible on the horizon, was a long low hunk of land. I'd hit Zanzibar bang on the nose. Columbus could not have been half so proud of his navigation as I. True, as the day wore on, I found that I had hit the island in about the middle instead of the south end. As I had planned. But what did that matter? Evidently, I had not taken that wretched northbound current sufficiently into consideration. I altered course so as to approach the north end, intending to round the island at that end, then sail down the Zanzibar Channel. As it turned out, this was a mistake, and I would have done better to round it at the south end. My reason for choosing the north was that the wind was coming dead from south, and it would have meant losing hours in tacking, and I was anxious to make port. I resisted the temptation to go in on the engine, with the result that it was about 4 in the afternoon before I was within a couple of miles of the shore. I sailed up the coast, looking for a suitable bay, or place to anchor in. There was no reef here, but I didn't fancy running aground on some hidden sand bank or coral outcrop. Fortunately, after about an hour's running, I saw some native fishing canoes, obviously returning home after the day's fishing. By holding my course, I would intercept them, and I decided to do this and ask them if there was a safe spot to anchor thereabouts. I sounded off my klaxon as soon as I was near enough, and the 3 boats turned towards me, so I luffed up into the wind and waited for them to come alongside. As soon as they were within hailing distance, I asked my question. For some reason or other, this caused howls of laughter, and after all 3 had conferred together, one approached alongside, and a very peculiar-looking native scrambled aboard and offered to pilot me in, assuring me that there was a perfectly safe anchorage in the bay opposite. Naturally, I accepted with alacrity, for these fishermen know the coast like the back of their hands. I now decided to use the engine, and my pilot gave me a hand with the sails. He was certainly very handy at the job, and laughingly told me that he was a very big sailor indeed, and knew all about ships, and I gathered that he was capable of taking over the job of the captain of the Queen Mary if offered it. He and Buller struck up an immediate friendship, probably because he smelt so strongly of fish. At least, that was Buller's reason. His, I don't know. I slowed down to just keep way on her, and we eventually dropped anchor in about 6 fathoms, 50 yards offshore. I'd made it. I don't think I'll ever lose the thrill of making my landfall, but that first time I was filled with quiet pride and utter satisfaction. I patted Uhuru and called her a good girl, and other foolish things men say under emotion, but was called back from this feast of self-congratulations by my pilot's canoe arriving to take him off. He refused a few shillings I offered him for his services, saying that we were both men and sailors, and naturally we helped each other, adding, as he climbed over the side, that he would come back in the evening and bring me some fruit and a chicken.